Most major developments in criminal investigations announce themselves. A search warrant served at dawn. An arrest made public through a department press release. A forensic breakthrough reported with official confirmation. Those are the moments the cameras show up for. Those are the developments that trend online within the hour. But some of the most significant movements in a major investigation happen quietly. No flashing lights. No breaking news banner crawling across the bottom of a screen. Just a court docket update, a scheduled hearing, and a defendant who has apparently changed his mind. This week, that quiet development belongs to Calella. After months of federal court proceedings, a delayed trial date, and a public posture of not guilty, Calella is now set to change his plea in a Tucson federal courthouse on July 2nd. On its face, it reads like administrative news. A defendant recalibrates. A hearing gets scheduled. The machinery of the court system moves forward. But anyone who has followed the Nancy Guthrie case closely knows better than to read this development at face value. Because plea changes do not happen without reason. Defendants do not walk into a courtroom and reverse course after months of a declared defense strategy unless something has shifted. Pressure, evidence, a conversation with a defense attorney that changed the calculus entirely, or perhaps a simple recognition that the risk of going to trial has grown too high to justify. The question that experienced investigators always ask first is not what happened in that hearing. It is what happened before it. To understand why this hearing matters at all, you have to go back to the very beginning. February 1st. An 84-year-old woman named Nancy Guthrie disappears from her home in the Catalina foothills, just outside Tucson, Arizona. Her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, is one of the most recognizable television journalists in the country. And within hours of Nancy's disappearance becoming public, that fact would reshape the entire nature of what followed. Blood was found on Nancy's porch. A doorbell camera captured a masked figure approaching her home in the middle of the night. And within days of Savannah Guthrie making a personal, emotional public plea for her mother's safe return, something arrived that no one had anticipated. Ransom messages. Not one. Several. Some came as text messages sent directly to members of the Guthrie family. Others arrived at media outlets through digital tip lines. Each demanded payment in Bitcoin. Each threatened consequences if deadlines were missed. The first of these formal notes reached 2 local television stations and a national entertainment outlet on February 2nd, exactly 1 day after Nancy was reported missing. That note set a price. $4 million in Bitcoin. The deadline was 5 p.m. on February 5th. If that deadline passed without payment, the price would increase to $6 million by the following Monday. The language, according to those who reviewed it, was cold and deliberate. It described its own terms as non-negotiable. Law enforcement moved quickly. Within days, investigators traced a separate set of ransom text messages sent directly to 2 members of the Guthrie family back to a man in California. His name was Calella, 42 years old, a resident of Hawthorne, California. According to the criminal complaint filed against him, Calella allegedly sent text messages to 2 family members asking, casually, whether they had sent the Bitcoin yet. Not demanding, not threatening, asking, as though confirming a transaction already in progress. He also reportedly made a brief phone call to 1 family member. When FBI agents found him, Calella did not attempt to deny what he had done. He told investigators he had been following the case on television. He said he located the family's contact information through what he called a cyber website. He was charged with transmitting a ransom demand across state lines and with using a telecommunications device to harass a person while concealing his identity. He pleaded not guilty in February. A trial date was set, then delayed. A motion to continue was filed and granted. And now, a change of plea hearing has been scheduled for July 2nd in Tucson. Here is where things become more complicated. From the very beginning of this case, investigators drew a careful and deliberate line between Calella's alleged actions and the original ransom notes that arrived at media outlets on February 2nd. Officials stated early on that Calella's text messages were not linked to that first formal demand. 2 separate threads, 2 separate origins, 2 separate investigations running parallel inside the same case. That distinction matters, because the original notes, the ones sent to media outlets, have always carried a different weight. And this week, that weight became official. Reports citing investigators familiar with the case now confirm that law enforcement believes those original ransom notes were sent by the actual person or persons who abducted Nancy Guthrie. Not an opportunist watching cable news from a living room in California. Not someone hoping to exploit a family's public grief for financial gain. The real abductor. Read that again. The notes that circulated in the first days of this investigation, the notes that set the tone for everything that followed, are now believed to have come directly from whoever took Nancy from her home. And the evidence behind that conclusion is specific. According to people familiar with the contents of the February 2nd note, it contained details that could not have come from a news report. It described an Apple Watch with a white band left on the floor of Nancy's bedroom. It described a broken light on her back porch. These are not details available to the public. These are details that require physical access to that home. Details that describe what the house looked like from the inside. That level of specificity does not come from someone following a story on television. Then came the second note, February 6th, for days after the first. Sent from the same digital location, written in the same style, bearing the same tone as its predecessor. But the content had changed entirely. There was no new financial demand, no updated deadline, no further threats about Bitcoin quantities. Instead, this note delivered something far more difficult to process. It indicated that Nancy Guthrie was dead, and then it said something even more unusual. It suggested that her death had not been intended, that whoever wrote those words had not planned for this outcome. Sit with that for a moment. A note that begins as a cold financial demand, precise, calculated, non-negotiable, transforms 4 days later into something that reads like regret. That pivot in tone is not the behavior of a scam artist running a scheme from a distance. That pivot suggests someone who was present, someone who experienced a change in circumstances that altered the entire situation, someone writing from the inside of something that had already gone wrong. The existence of that second note was kept from the public for nearly 4.5 months. Law enforcement asked media organizations to hold the information, presumably to protect the integrity of ongoing investigative work or to preserve the possibility of additional contact from whoever had sent it. The note was not revealed publicly until June 22nd, 4.5 months, while the public waited for updates that rarely came. That gap tells you something important. It tells you that this investigation has never actually gone quiet. It tells you that a significant body of information has been moving behind closed doors, shared among a small circle of federal investigators, prosecutors, and perhaps a select group of family members, while the rest of the world watched and waited. So return now to Derek Calella. He insists, through his own statements, that he acted alone, that he saw a grieving family's story on television, found contact information through an online source, and made the decision to insert himself into one of the most closely watched missing persons cases in the country. On paper, that explanation places him entirely outside the larger investigation. A secondary figure, a man accused of exploiting tragedy rather than causing it. But separate does not mean irrelevant, and his own explanation raises questions that have never been fully answered. Think about what that decision actually required. He did not simply send an impulsive message from a publicly listed number. According to the criminal complaint, he sought out private contact information for specific family members of a woman whose disappearance was a federal investigation. He phrased his message as though payment was already expected, not as a demand, as a follow-up, as a confirmation request. That is a calculated choice. That is someone who understood enough about the situation to model how an actual ransom interaction might sound. Was that knowledge entirely self-generated? Did he develop that framing purely from what he saw on television? Or did something else shape his understanding of how this case was unfolding? Investigators have not alleged outside involvement. The public record does not suggest a larger network. But the question itself has never fully disappeared, and it has not disappeared now. When a defendant changes a plea in a major federal case, experienced investigators ask one question before any other. What changed? Not what is on the docket. Not what the hearing will look like procedurally. What changed in the weeks or months before the defendant or their counsel decided that going to trial was no longer the right calculation? There are standard answers to that question. Prosecutors may have strengthened their case with new evidence. Defense attorneys may have assessed the evidentiary landscape and concluded that the odds of acquittal had dropped below a tolerable threshold. Digital records, phone data, or financial trails may have produced something that made the original defense strategy untenable. A witness who had been silent may have agreed to testify. All of those possibilities apply to Calella's case in a standard reading of what happens in federal proceedings. But there is another possibility, one that applies specifically here. The broader Nancy Guthrie investigation has been advancing quietly, behind the framework of public silence that has defined this case since February. Significant forensic work has been underway. Mixed DNA samples recovered from inside Nancy's home were sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico for analysis. Sheriff Chris Nanos acknowledged this publicly. He has also been explicit about why the process takes time. Forensic analysis of mixed biological samples is painstaking work. Errors made in haste lead to wrong conclusions, and wrong conclusions in a case of this magnitude are not recoverable. That acknowledgement reframes the entire timeline. The months of apparent silence were not absence of activity. They were process. Slow, methodical, legally careful process, moving forward entirely outside of public view. And when a major investigation begins producing confirmed answers, when the original ransom notes are formally tied to the real abductor, when forensic timelines solidify, when the picture investigators have been building for months begins to take a definitive shape, that confidence does not stay contained to the central case. It ripples outward. Every related legal proceeding sits inside the orbit of a major investigation. Every defendant whose charges are even tangentially connected to that case feels the pressure shift when the larger case gains traction. A defense attorney representing someone like Calella is constantly reassessing. If the broader investigation appears to be moving toward resolution, does that change how a jury might perceive a related defendant? Does it change prosecutorial appetite for negotiation? Does it change the risk calculation entirely? There is no public evidence establishing a direct connection between recent developments in the Nancy Guthrie investigation and Calella's decision to change his plea. No reporting has drawn that line explicitly, but the timing sits in an uncomfortable place for anyone paying close attention. A change of plea hearing scheduled for July 2nd, arriving just weeks after public confirmation that the original ransom notes are now believed to have come from Nancy's actual abductor. That overlap does not prove anything, but it is exactly the kind of overlap that experienced observers do not dismiss. There is also the matter of a theory that has circulated among security experts and investigators since early in this case, one that may explain some of the stranger decisions made by whoever wrote those original notes. A report from the cybersecurity firm CertiK identified the Guthrie case as fitting the profile of what the firm describes as a proxy target situation, a scenario in which someone is taken not for who they are personally, but because of their relationship to a high-profile or financially significant family member. The goal, in this framework, is not a traditional ransom. It is access to cryptocurrency holdings. The victim becomes leverage. The pressure is not applied directly to the victim, but to those who control the assets being demanded. Sheriff Nanos has acknowledged being made aware of this theory and said he passed it along to the investigative team. He did not confirm or deny whether it has become part of the official investigative direction. If the theory is accurate, it explains several things that have otherwise resisted explanation. It explains why the demands focused so heavily and so specifically on Bitcoin rather than traditional payment methods. It explains why the notes went to media outlets rather than arriving through private, controlled channels. It explains the urgency paired with very public exposure, behavior that runs completely counter to how traditional ransom schemes operate. It would also mean that whoever took Nancy may have left behind a trail through cryptocurrency networks, a trail that, unlike physical evidence, does not degrade with time. But the theory also leaves gaps. It does not explain the complete absence of proof of life throughout the entire duration of this case. Traditional ransom schemes, even those built around digital assets, typically involve some form of confirmation that the victim is alive and that the demand has meaning beyond its words. That confirmation never arrived, and that absence has haunted this investigation from the beginning. This case now carries two parallel tracks that have never cleanly converged and have never been conclusively separated. Track 1. Derek Calella, a man in California who allegedly saw a family's public pain, found contact information, and decided to present himself as someone with real information and real leverage. Charged. Pleaded not guilty. Now, apparently, preparing to change that plea. Track 2. an unidentified individual or individuals who sent real notes to real media outlets. Notes that contained real details from inside Nancy's home. Notes that evolved from financial demand to apparent regret. Notes that investigators now formally believe came from the person responsible for her disappearance. Those two tracks have always been treated as separate investigations for a reason. The evidence connecting Calella to Nancy's abduction does not exist in the public record. Investigators have never alleged it. Courts have never asserted it. But law enforcement does not build cases in silos. Investigators watch all related proceedings simultaneously. They track every defendant whose actions touched, even tangentially, the timeline of a major case. They look for patterns. They watch for connections that have not yet been made public. They build timelines that extend well beyond what any court filing reveals. The first person formally charged in a major case is rarely the final target of the investigation. That is not speculation. That is how federal investigations routinely operate. Law enforcement charges what they can charge early, then uses every available thread, every statement, every cooperation, to move closer to the people who matter most. Whether Celella holds any thread worth following in the direction of Nancy's real abductor is not something the public record currently answers. Investigators have not suggested it. No report has alleged it. But investigators do not ignore questions simply because the public cannot yet see the answers. On July 2nd, inside a federal courthouse in Tucson, Calella is expected to stand before a judge and enter a new plea. That moment may be entirely routine. A man who assessed his legal situation, consulted with counsel, and concluded that a plea agreement offered more certainty than a trial verdict. It happens every day. There may be nothing more to it than that. But it may also be something else. It may be the kind of quiet moment that looks unremarkable from the outside, while carrying significant weight inside the machinery of an ongoing federal investigation. The kind of moment that experienced prosecutors and investigators mark carefully on a timeline, not because of what it says publicly, but because of what it may represent privately. What did Calella's defense team review before recommending this course of action? What did prosecutors offer, and what did they ask for in return? What information, if any, sits behind this decision that has not been and may never be made public? For an investigation that has spent nearly 5 months carefully managing what the public knows, and when they know it, those questions are not hypothetical. They are simply the next ones on a very long list. The hearing may provide answers. It may produce only new questions. It may reveal, in what is not said, that the investigation has moved further than anyone outside a small circle of federal agents and prosecutors currently understands. Nancy Guthrie has been missing since February 1st. The notes believed to describe her fate have existed since February 6th. The public learned of them on June 22nd. That gap 4.5 months between what investigators knew and what the rest of the world was allowed to see is the most important number in this entire case, because it tells you that the investigation has always been several steps ahead of the narrative. And the question that July 2nd raises is not simply what Calella is about to say in a Tucson courtroom. The question is what investigators already know that made this moment possible. That answer has not arrived yet. It may not arrive on July 2nd. But in a case this carefully managed, this deliberately paced, and this deeply layered, the answers almost always arrive eventually. The only question is what they reveal when they do.